Matt, hello, welcome
Karen,
back. So good to see you again.
likewise.
So you are in South Dakota?
I've made the classical journey. I grew up in Pierre, South Dakota, which is smack dab in the middle of the state. And after the West Coast, I've returned to the same place I was born. Now, I'm not living in the same house. You find me kind of next to brick walls, but I do have a government job, so things are looking up.
So you mean the government job is better than working at the coffee shop?
No, not necessarily. In terms of the task,
Uh-huh.
I'm indifferent to the tasks, but the overall, well, I suppose it bleeds into what we might talk about, i.e. the sovereignty of the good.
Mhm.
And I would maybe dislocate the two subjects into process versus task. So for example, I enjoyed talking about wine and pouring it and eating homemade bread and knowing that a 7-year-old strain was in the larder below the homestead restaurant. I loved all those tasks. But as far as a horizon for what I might hope to do with 20 years, knock on wood, if I were to have 20 years, etc., there wasn't so much of a pathway.
Mhm.
Whereas with a government job, they're older than most corporations. Perhaps they're the oldest corporation. There seems to be, almost to a leveling effect, a complacent middle. And frankly, before and after, the world is mine. And so it's a level or breed of security that I wasn't accustomed to for the last 4 years. So I guess I'm basking in that center.
Mhm. Well, and it's
That's what I
perfect for
meant.
someone who wants to be a writer. I mean, you want time to think, you want time to write, you want, um, if you were in high tech or something like that, you're working 24/7. You're thinking 24/7, how do I get this thing to work? You don't have any time to think about ideas. So,
You know, that's such a great point. Spinoza, for example, who wrote the Ethics, which people still study to this day, that married um, geometric projections, like what is a perfect square, what's the way to derive a square in language, so propositionally. He married that to what he thought was a sealed tight ethic that could govern people wherever they happened to be, whether they were under a monarchy and a democracy, whether they had religion A or religion B. And he wrote that while he had a day job and a very stable job of sawing down glass to make optical lenses.
hmm.
Now it caused his premature death because all the shale of glass went into his lungs. But in the medium to short run, he was well provided. So yeah, I think there's a history of thinkers and philosophers that take the group job that a lot of people find themselves in, and then they use the errant time to take the risks, the conceptual risks, versus the like someone in software. I mean, they're taking physical hard risks to make it work in real time. Ideas hardly work in real time, but
Mhm.
which makes them timeless.
Well, I guess the trick is to develop an idea that is timeless that also works in real time.
Yeah, yeah. The I mean, we could go the route of the P versus NP together since we talked about that. We could incorporate other things from your side.
I want to, I mean, I've been really
Yeah.
working on this, okay? And this is Iris Murdoch and the Sovereignty of the Good. And you had said we would read the first section, which is perfection. So the first 45 pages. So I have, you can see I have really worked on it, underlined a lot.
Likewise.
So it's a lot of stuff to cover in one talk. So I thought I could just pick out a few things and
Yeah.
maybe we could start there. it took me quite a while to get the drift of what she was talking about because she is referring to a number of philosophers and thinkers of whom I have never heard, and it's not even easy to find them on the internet. So she's pushing back against some ideas that she doesn't like, and I had to try to figure out what it was she was pushing back against in order to understand what her point of view was. But the first question that popped out to me as I was reading along comes along on page 8, and that is, how does will relate to reason? So I thought we might toss that around a little bit. The question I put under that was, can reason turn the rudder of my will? Because it seems to me that that's what she's pushing back against this guy named Hampshire, who seems to think that everything resides in the will and choice arena. And she feels like it actually resides somewhere else. So I wanted to know what you thought about what she was saying there.
She sticks close to Hampshire. And one thing I noted is, one, I'll quickly contextualize it. She's delivering a lecture in 1964, and this is the transcript of the lecture. So
this
she's
a lecture? Oh,
yes.
My gosh, what a mind.
I know. But I think the contextualization helps because she's following a rubric that her contemporaries would follow, which is to say, and Tolkien did this with the monster and their critics. When you're delivering a lecture to students or a peer group, you're telling them what they already know. So why deliver it at all? It wasn't a popularization. So what she was, in fact, in my opinion, doing was she was playing the game in a Petersonian sense of adding a chapter to the philosophic story. And every chapter is the arguments of past philosophers. That's why she brings up all those other people. And in order to make her chapter work, she has to play the same game they played in their time, which is to say, you know the outcome before you write the first sentence. Just like a story, many writers write to the end, already knowing the ending. And the end conditions everything that comes before it in a cause-effect relation. So that's its code. And similar to, say, the hero's journey of, well, the journey out, the call to adventure only works because you know the goal is to return better than when you left. Whether it's returned with a spouse, the virgin saved from the dragon, or a pot of gold, or some realization that you could not have found in this small town that you had to go on top of a mountain, etc. In the philosophic essay, you leave commonly understood terms behind and battle the dragon of some eminent philosopher's definition of those terms and make your solution seem perfect because it fits the questions you were begging along the way and dropping like little breadcrumbs, so that when you finally insert it, it seems inevitable. So when she says near the end, it's not a matter of finding the object of the good or becoming someone who lives a good life that others can imitate. It's constantly honing the perception of the object and coming closer to it in that way while changing yourself to see more of its features and benefits. So and she begs the questions with so many different places and says Moore didn't have it right, or Wittgenstein had it better, so that when she finally says that, it just seems to click. But if she didn't do her job right and didn't conform to the conventions of that philosophic essay, it'll come too quick or too late. And she won't fail because her argument was bad. She will have failed because her she wasn't playing by the conventional rules of that piece of literature, I would say, or that story frame. So I just wanted to say that because I don't want us to get hanged up. I don't want myself to get hanged up on the words like reason or will, because I don't think she's trying to give us a definition of reason. She's trying to play with reason to get to her point at the end, which is, well, I think we'll find out what it is. But so yeah, with that said, like she's doing things like she wants to say that there's such a thing as the actions you and I can see that's in the public, such as voting, talking in a language, attending church and performing the ritual of graduation or going to college or being onboarded for a career in an organization. Those are things we can see and many people can have different points of view on. But then there's the inner life, which no one really knows how to describe and get out there. So does it exist? And if it does, what's its status? And this New Hampshire guy says it really doesn't exist. At best, it's free association or it's daydreaming. And I think she wants to save the appearance of daydream and free association as a respectable human activity. One, because she's a writer, right? She's a fiction writer on the side. But two, I think she thinks it's invaluable pieces of information for what motivates our will and why we use our will at all.
Mm-hmm. Wow, that's a really good introduction to straighten out some of these things that her writing made me think about. And so I'm going to throw some of those things out there for you. I wasn't so much talking about the definitions of will and reason, but when she talked about Hampshire's view that she was in some sort of opposition to, I was trying to understand what she thought of his view, and you just explained that perfectly, so that really helps. I'm going to tell you a little story that I mentioned in one of my earlier videos. So you may have already heard it, but I think it fits right here. So when my daughter was little, I started to notice that just before she learned every new skill, she would go through a period of intense frustration. And when I kind of wound it back in my mind, I could remember back to at least when she was about 6 months old and she was just starting to think about crawling. She would see something across the room that she wanted. She couldn't get there. She'd be so frustrated. But she thought there might be a way to get there. And so it was that intense desire for that thing that she wanted that motivated her to try to get herself turned over from her back onto her stomach so that she could start moving somehow. And she would try and fail, try and fail, try and fail, all the time, building up muscles, all the time, building new skills, learning new things about what different things were in the room because her attention was always being scattered. But she kept trying, and finally she learns to crawl. Then she can get over there and get that thing. But of course, now she can crawl, she can go anywhere and get anything that's on the floor. So her scope of opportunity has broadened a lot. But now she sees something on a higher shelf. Well, she can't get to that unless she can learn to stand up. And then after that, she has to learn to not only stand up, but walk because maybe there's something on a higher shelf on the other side of the room. And then after that, she has to learn to talk. And so every single one of these levels, we start with a desire for something that we want. And that desire somehow connects with our action so that we develop the skills that we need to achieve that thing. And she talks a lot in here about attention. And I noticed that Jordan Peterson says that attention is a higher function than intellect. And he says that because intellect, in his evolutionary viewpoint, intellect arises out of attention. Attention comes first, the ability to pay attention comes first, and then intellect.
And I think that's, I would want to put a circle around what you said with a highlighter, because I think it's a great point, one. And two, I think it allows us to get out of the mere presence of this text and see how it converses with contemporary thinkers, especially the prominent ones like Jordan B. Peterson. Because I think if Peterson sat down with Iris Murdoch, they would find much to agree on.
Yes.
Especially in pragmatism. So to your point, the attention comes first and then the intellect gains its capacities. Well, I'm no expert in evolutionary theory, but from what I understand is the organism adapts to its environment. It doesn't create the environment whole cloth. And so the effort to concretize experience in our conceptualizations, to schematize and routinize everything we do, to explain ourselves to ourselves, comes after we find ourselves in a world situated with certain, as you pointed out, certain abilities and reaches. Like before she could run, she had to walk, and before she had to walk, she could crawl. And you can't just skip the walking to running. You can't intellectually leap over your own feet. And there's a book called Metaphors We Live By, which follows this train of thought and predicates our major metaphors on our embodiedness.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it that most of our metaphors, according to their study, can be boiled down to the bridge and transmission through a bridge? Well, one might be we're these organisms that shout out through a little orifice our desires. That's one way in which we modularize that. We say, I would like a glass of water, and it comes out like a stream, and it has a directionality like water down an aqueduct. And so it's no wonder that when we talk about metaphors of loosening data and compressing it, it has this idea of a tube, because we're organisms that don't speak out of all directions, but of one in a very concise, compressed way. So to your point, she also talks about tools, or no, she talks about Wittgenstein. So one of the philosophers she addresses is Wittgenstein, and she uses him as a cheerleader to her own argument, because one of the things Wittgenstein did was he took language away from the proselytizers. So for example, someone who would say, childhood development is X, Y, and Z. And that's what it is. And if you're not in line with that, you're a bad parent, right? They can get really, like, books have been written. This is how one should raise their child. This is what one should look for. This is how to know if you're doing it right. Like this compression of language down to, this is the definition, this is it. And this is the steps. Prescriptive.
Mm-hmm.
The only problem is multiple books like that have been written, and they don't necessarily, they do contradict one another. So Wittgenstein took language away and said, the meaning of words is what we do with them. Now, whether or not that's true or false, Iris Murdoch in this piece somewhere says it was good to separate the meaning of words from the activity of language. Because right now we're doing things without having to go and check, okay, is Karen tracking with Matt? Is Matt tracking with Karen's use of the word walk, grow, for example, because that's a controlling concept for what we're talking about, growth. Are we tracking with each other? The writer doesn't really know. We don't really know right now, it seems, but it's good enough that we're able to communicate. It's practically sufficient for a whole host of reasons, one of which is you and I have a history together. We've talked before. And there's in that a certain privacy that the audience right now isn't privy to. And the Hampshire guy didn't like that too much. He wanted to exorcise history and privacy from the organism, right? Everything was public. Everything was subject to points of view. Am I too far from left field, or is that connected?
Oh, no. I'm tracking. But before we get too far off the attention issue, I did want to show a video clip of Jordan Peterson, just so that we can make that connection.
Yeah, let's do it.
I'm going to share screen here.
It'll be helpful for our attention to be on the same icon or object.
Yeah. So, I'm not very fast at this. Hold on a second.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, here we go.
If you pay attention to the things that shine forth, because what you're seeing is the reality instead of the map, you're gaining access to.
Okay. Are you still there, Matt?
Yes, this is his talk on potential.
Yes,
oh,
and this is just a 1.5 minute clip. So, and he's
you pay attention to the things that shine forth, because what you're seeing is the reality instead of the map, you're gaining access to the real information that's in the world. It's not prepackaged information, because that can be false. It's the real information flowing out from the ground of being. And if you pay attention to that, it will help you move towards the goals that you've already established for yourself as a good citizen, that are part of the inbuilt value structure that you've adopted. But at the same time, it will do something else. It will lead you to transform the nature of those goals. Because as you pursue the thing that guides your interest, and more information is revealed, then by absorbing that information, which is learning essentially, you build yourself into a different person, a stronger and more informed person, and a more intact person, a person with more integrity and with more strength and with more direction. And at the same time, you differentiate your map, and so you're living more and more in the real world. So as you approach your specific goal, even if it's a culturally conditioned goal, the learning that you do along the way transforms you, and it transforms the nature of your goal.
So I took the time to transcribe that. I took the time to transcribe that because I thought it was such an amazing, amazing little bit. But when he's talking about the inbuilt value structure that you've adopted, that's a lot of what Iris Murdoch is talking about, is how does that inbuilt value structure connect up with our environment and with the way that we live and everything. And
that's so relevant to, in my opinion, what's in the news cycle and what's going on in major cities.
Keep going.
Yeah, I mean, there's an actual struggle for expression of what certain people mobilized feel is their value structure that is not epitomized in their residence, their neighborhood, or their country. Now, whether or not it is sincere or insincere, it's out of the window for me, but I can't help but think the Black Lives Matter as an organization and mobilization of people, and I forgot what it's called in Seattle, Cap Hill or something like this, Lord of the Flies experiment, where people decided to become sovereign citizens and build walls in a arbitrary place and not let anyone in until too many people became sick. Like, I see that as what Peterson was talking about, although missing some vital piece. I don't know what that is yet, but I don't think Peterson would look at that little subdivision in Seattle and say they were changing their map and they were learning more about the real world as they were taking on the complexity of creating society from scratch. And yet it seems that is exactly what he is saying in that clip.
Well, so, okay, so what, it's always interesting to me what other people hear when they hear something, because you made a leap over into an area that would never have occurred to me. So that's fascinating. When I heard him do that bit, and I both times that I listened to the whole potential talk that he did at TED, I hear him referring to this idea that he's talked about before, where at every moment we are facing a field of infinite potential. And we have virtually no mechanism, seemingly no mechanism, to decide which way we're going to walk across that field, because how do we choose? So if you don't have an aim, and that's his big thing, once you establish an aim and you look above the horizon at the highest good of which you can conceive, that organizes your vision, and then things come into your field of vision that put you on alert. He calls that like these little phenomenon, shining, phenesthai is the Greek word, I guess, shining out in front of you. They're shining because they're little tears in the map. So the light is kind of showing up because the map is not the reality. The map is just the map, right? But there's little tears in the map. So there's little bits of reality shining out there that he calls, and this is kind of woo-woo, but it's your future calling you forward. It's where you could go. And so it's a little like interest, or some of the old philosophers used to talk about the golden thread. So it's like this little golden thread that winds out in front of you and kind of shows you where to go. That's what I hear him saying. And to me, what he's saying is your desire for that thing orients your action. It enlivens your willingness to sacrifice whatever it is that you're required to sacrifice to move from the present into the future. You always have to give up something in the present, count the cost, in order to move towards that desired future. Like the baby gives up the comfort of just laying there on their blanket and playing with their thing above their head because they want that thing across the room. And so they'll work to get it. Somewhere along the line, though, as we grow up, we somewhat lose that connection between the desire and the intense willingness to sacrifice and struggle and fail and work. And so adulthood is a little bit about how do you get that back so that you can move forward, you can get things done, you can accomplish, you can get motivated. So that's what I was hearing.
Yeah. And I like what you did, because to my mind, you scaled out and put it in a scheme where the critical words you used to my ears did not have to have a connotation of good or bad, such as the field of possibility, like a blank canvas, the horizon, which is, say, the frame to go off from into the unspeakable, and then from there to glean one's ideal, which is not found in the soil of one's circumstance. And like none of that connotes so far. And then that laser beam tracking of the golden thread and the willingness to let the dead wood burn off and to make the necessary sacrifices in alignment to whatever the ideal is and what the one is not that is approaching it, so that they can be in alignment. It's the loving to know, knowing to love.
Yep.
However, what I want to push back with, since we're starting to play tug of war now with this golden thread, is I believe we're seeing that in real time all the time. But one of the ways in which it's amplified is through violence. And how can anyone have the right to say, you shouldn't throw that brick through the glass window of this business owner's livelihood, when they will report the light shining through the tear of my map says this is how I will get out and express what has been latent in me for so long and held back, and I've had to resist for so long. And so I think this is where Peterson could be amiably criticized, in that he speaks so eloquently of the individual and the individual's burden to bear. But has he, or can we find a way to hook that up to the collective and the common good, so that we can say, you shouldn't throw the brick through the window of someone else's house, even if you feel called to do so as a matter of your worldview, and yet still give that person place, or not, which is the same thing, terminate that person, cancel them, kick them out of society, shoo them away. Because in fact, what they are reproducing is the hero's journey, just in a way that the people around won't sign up for. And that, I think, is where the sovereignty of good in Murdoch steps in, because early on in the essay, she says, this is a work of moral philosophy, her argument. And moral philosophy is about how individuals can seek the common good together. What sort of organizations of people allow for those multiple tracks of following that thing, as Peterson said, without destroying everyone else in its wake. Yeah.
Okay, so let's go there.
Yeah.
So in preparing for this, I also had a conversation earlier this week with Michael, and we were writing some docs back and forth to each other. And so I'm not sure who said this, if it was him or if it was me. It might have been him. But anyway, I wrote it down. Progressive Epicureanism has a goal. And I've been reading quite a lot lately that there are a number of thinkers who think that what we're going through in this era is a kind of Epicureanism, which has been kind of co-opted by the progressive movement. So now we have a progressive Epicureanism. Would you care for our listeners to explain what Epicureanism is? You're much more of a philosopher than I am.
Oh, I'd rather hear you describe it from the vantage point of you and Michael, because I don't know how you're using the word, and I'd like to know.
Well, I just have a feeling about it, but to me, Epicureanism is more like, is it kind of what feels good? Is that, would you say that's pretty much Epicureanism?
When I was in college, I didn't study the Epicureans too much or over much, but what I did glean from Epicurus was it was a materialist movement.
Yes.
And the ideology behind it was the world comes to us through some senses, the eyes, and it's in little particulate forms, which have their unique shapes that are not infinite. They're finite. And the better you can become at recognizing those shapes and putting them in their right place, the less pain you will have and the more human freedom you will experience. So I think a modern image of that is a wine connoisseur, because you've taken the infinite complexity of a grape and you've put the shapes of all the tastes and fragrances and all the things you could enumerate, which are not infinite, down to these separate bottles of these separate years in these separate storage containers for separate occasions. And you've maximized your human freedom by being able to enjoy them at the right time in the right place with the right friends. And to ask for anything more.
Your human pleasure, aren't you?
Pleasure, yeah. And that's what pleasure becomes redefined as in an Epicurean metaphysic. It's the highest a human being can hope for, is to have pleasure through the senses and embodied salvation. Any talk of an afterlife, therefore, it's not of the Epicurean worldview. There's no afterlife.
Okay, so the thing that distinguishes progressive Epicureanism from just Epicureanism is that the progressive Epicurean has a goal. They want to feel equality.
Wow.
Equality is the feeling they're going for. It's not that I want to feel luxury or I want to feel, you know, the comfort of great food, or I want to feel the feeling of drunkenness, but I want to feel equality. I want to feel that everybody's equal. That's the feeling I need. Okay? So if you need that feeling in order to be happy, it becomes like an addiction. It's like, you know, they talk about you got to get your hit. You've got to have this thing in order to feel good. And if you can't get it, then you got to strive for it in whatever way you can. And the need that arises out of that addiction, that, as John Vervaeke is always talking about, the reciprocal narrowing, the need that arises out of that, it can also occur as a result of rigid ideologies. Your ideology can produce that need in you, because that's the thing your ideology is aiming for, is equality. Then you got to have that thing in order to feel okay about yourself and in order to feel okay about the world you live in. So there's no room for independent thought. There's no place to go when anomalous information enters the frame. You don't have any other options. You got to have that feeling. That's why even coercion will look like a solution, because if it's such an intractable problem that you can't get it any other way, coercion looks like a solution.
And I think, wow, this is really good. So that is such an odd way to talk about Epicureanism. I'm stimulated by it because equality, I've tended to think of equality as a notion and not as a thing with a physical substrate that comes with it. But here, because the Epicurean, like, I think it's so right that you said they need their hit, because they didn't think they could receive information about the world apart from impressions on the senses, moment by moment. There's no such thing as the past or the future for an Epicurean. It's the now, it's the feelings, it's the heart rate and the blood pressure. Now it's to require of equality to have a substrate that hits you. That is so needy. So I get what you're saying now, I think, with the addiction metaphor, because one needs to be a progressive Epicurean for equality to have some tangible asset all the time to it. I mean, it can't be something that we can disagree on. In the same way that if I'm hungry, you and I can't disagree on what food is at that moment. Because the moment you and I disagree on what food is, we go all the way to the metaphysics of our subject. My body is telling me you haven't eaten for 3 days. You will become irrelevant to me at this very moment, because I can't think. I got to get food. I'm taking for granted the substrate. And I will look for people who share my belief that food has a substrate so that they will feed me or point me in the direction of a restaurant. Mm-hmm. Ideology could work that way.
It does. I totally think that these really, really, really tight ideologies, the ones that are so progressively narrowed down to just crystalline formation, that they're like an addiction. Jordan Peterson always uses the word ideologically possessed. I think that basically means that they're trapped in an addiction. And I recognize it because there were a few years in there where I really got into politics, and I was just reading stuff nonstop all day long. It's like I had to know more. I had to know more. And, finally my husband said to me one day, what's happening? Where did you go? Because that's what reciprocal narrowing does. It narrows your world down so much that you just disappear. There's nothing left but this thing you're possessed by, right? And that was one of the great things that happened just before I ran into Jordan Peterson, was just being able to let go of all that and just, who cares, And then, of course, I started listening to him, and that's one of his big things, that you have to fight off letting yourself become ideologically possessed, because it's all
and
the
the
way down.
and the rainbow colors of how do we separate an addiction pattern from a religious ritual. It's a fine line. And I can draw from my own experience for an example. When I was in my very early 20s in college, I was part of a Christian organization, a bunch of guys like myself, and we began to geek out over John Calvin's Institute of Christian Theology, where he presumed to surmise all that was necessary from Christian dogma, from the resurrection of Christ to John Calvin's right hand bringing the pen down. Mm-hmm. And it wasn't an infinite book. It was rather short. And it seemed to have a strong opinion on everything. And we didn't know it, but we were buying into, all right, if I can commit the lexicon to mind, and if I can conform my way of thinking to these propositions and their consequence. Okay, so there's an infinite heaven, an infinite hell. There has to be that polarity. There has to be an election because God is all powerful and I am not. And then that's true no matter what. So now everything, even the way I wake up in the morning and exercise, has to be brought to that counter. I've got to take my prescription pill of John Calvin's specific reading of Genesis. And if I don't, then I don't know God. Which is to say, if I don't, then I'm not, I guess I don't know my own past. If I don't identify myself as either racist or anti-racist, right? Like certain groups within, there was this email that went out. I don't remember the source, but it was trying to make everyone awake to the idea that everyone has implicit racism. And that language, forget the word racism and forget the word implicit. What I would say is the behavior conditioning that's going on is the very same thing that my friends and I were doing to each other when we were in our early 20s, committing to memory John Calvin's Institutes of Christian Religion. And so ideology and religion of the possessed kind, I think there's an intractable narrowing on both sides. And so the old atheist argument that I can be an atheist without God, that may be true in words and in parlance, but the behaviors that we do are the same. Like bad faith is bad faith. An addiction is an addiction. And okay, I want to bring it back to what we're actually talking about. Like the narrowing process itself, like it's hard to know when it starts to nip it in the bud. Maybe we could find a way to talk about that and introduce that into our conversation.
Yeah. I'm going to go to page 33. She says, scientific language tries to be impersonal and exact, yet accessible for purposes of teamwork. And the degree of accessibility can be decided in relation to definite practical goals. This is what you were talking about. The living and radical nature of language is something we forget at our peril. It goes back to what you were talking about with the language, right? We are men and we are moral agents before we are scientists, and the place of science in human life must be discussed in words. So what I get her saying here is that words, story, comes before science, in the same way that attention precedes intellect.
I saw what you did there. Wow. Keep going.
Yeah. So then attention generates action and action generates intellect. That's the connection between attention and intellect in my mind. Attention generating action is our mechanism for increasing skills, which increases information. So this attention thing is vitally important to keep us always open to information. Because if you narrow down and you say, I know everything I already need to know, it's all contained right here in this little book, whatever the little book is. Could be the little black book of communism. It could be the little Mao's little red book. It could be the Alinsky's rules. It could be, you know, it could be Calvin's whatever. I mean, I don't want to make anybody mad, but if you have a book that says this is it, this is everything you need to know, you don't need to know anything outside of this, that's on the way to perdition, because it was, you know, and this is John Milton's viewpoint, but John Milton's viewpoint was that was Satan's byline. I know everything I need to know. I don't need anything outside myself. And what that looks like to me is quantum physics or particle physics, when they keep reducing the space around a group of particles until finally, when there's no more space, the particles will self-organize into a crystalline formation where it's very low entropy, very low information. There's nothing more that can happen. It's just frozen. And so the attention aspect is the important thing, because that's where the new information comes from. So she says, I have used the word attention, which I borrow from Simone Weil, to express the idea of a just and loving gaze directed upon individual reality. I believe this to be the characteristic and proper mark of the active moral agent.
Wow.
It's the knowing to love, loving to know thing. The just and loving gaze, what I see that to be is that arises out of a heart of gratitude, that says reality is good. So I can look with a loving gaze upon these things that come into my field of vision, and the attention that I give to them with a loving gaze is going to affect the quality of information I gain from that attention. Am I on the right track?
Well, I'm not here to say right or wrong.
Well, you know more about this woman than I do. It sounds like you've read the whole book. I'm only on page 45.
Well, I think the joy of philosophy is, I mean, she doesn't have the final word on her own argument. I mean, it's up for us to I think philosophy, if looked at as literature, I mean, it burns away. Most philosophy isn't remembered. The stuff that remains, it doesn't remain because there was something in it that was fireproof, but there was something in it that, to your point of attention, triggered the audience to chew on it, to find the seeds after the fact and replant them and tend the garden of that cluster of arguments, that culture. Like it's the work of the audience. It's the work of the reader to keep philosophy alive. It's not the writer. But to your, like, I was digesting what you had said, and I was really trying to check my preconceptions and my reflexive nature of speech, because I didn't want to just react to what you said. I wanted to speak to the words you spoke. So I was just giving myself time to do that. You remember in the beginning, she talks about Hampshire and movement, where anything internal is free association, like Freud, and that's scary territory. It's shadowy. I mean, who knows why I do what I do? It may be because my relationship with my mom is off kilter, or it's because I secretly harbor a desire to murder, right? When you go the Freud route in New Hampshire, in Mr. Hampshire's view, you see that complexity as a monster. And so it's best to build a wall in front of that thing. And so let's just not free associate. let's figure out a way to organize a society around public information, open sourced software. Well, people can't live that way because everyone has secrets and everyone has privacy, and you can't think publicly all the time without being silenced in a tyranny. And so how do people work out ideas and figure out, well, I want to be more sophisticated. I want to have more connections. I want to attend better and wider. Well, I have to be wrong 99% of the time then. So how can we forgive each other in our error making, especially error making out loud? I think that's one of the reasons why I think it's important to have a robust philosophy of privacy. And so it can't just be the fear of the dark shadows. I mean, there has to be something positive. And so when she says the active moral agent, I hear her preparing everything for that phrase in the beginning with Mr. Hampshire's, we need to be active and outward and publicly funded, to, yeah, we can be all that active too, but we're going to do it by gazing correctly, not by moving correctly, which is her 180 turn from Hampshire while using his insights. So it's a brilliant move, and philosophers do it all the time to each other. They're ruthless. But I don't know if she earned it. Like, I don't know if it's true. Like, it sounds good, but I don't know if it's true yet. Does the gaze accomplish what she thinks it achieves?
So gazing correctly rather than moving.
Yeah, like, I wonder if there's more to that than the word, or if it's just a play on words, because she wants to say we need metaphors of vision, right? Early on, she says we have to be able to talk about vision. There's a way, for example, is there a good person? And can I see good people? The cynical view is no, there's no such thing as a good object, let alone a good person. There are good habits. There's ways to get out of hell, but we don't know what heaven looks like. The best we can do is follow that little thing, like Peterson said, which is kind of not bad. And so just follow good habits. But I think she wants to say, yes, but why follow good habits? Are we doing it with our right foot and then shooting our left foot with the cynical view of, yeah, but there's no such thing as the good. They're just proxy good habits along the way. And it's really just up to people to legislate or argue about and bicker all day. Well, like when a mother looks at a child and says, this is the best thing that's happened to me, or I've grown in a way and matured into something that I could not have been without this relationship to child. Are they speaking of the object in front of them, speaking of it, or are they giving lip service to the object that could have been iterated in some other mode by some other object? And it's really just about the movements. Pick up, hold, pat back, help to walk, and then let out of the nest. Like, I mean, you follow that to its logical conclusions, people could have androids and practice being a father or mother in front of that thing. And if the good is just a habit, there'd be no difference. But to Murdoch's point, if the good hypothetically is an object, we just don't know how to see it. So we work our way towards it by performing rituals, like she said. Then maybe that child is a good thing. I just don't know what that means. I can give it lip service all day. That's like a religious confession. And I'm not wrong for doing that, but you push me on, what do I mean by God? What do I mean by love for my child? I can't tell you. Now, two paths. Should I despair over that and say, it's all false? Let's just scientifically reduce everything down to atoms. And to your point, then there's no room to grow, no room to move. We become nihilists eventually. Or I think she's trying to find a rehabilitative approach to the good, the true, and the beautiful. Hey, and it's kind of like Peterson. You got this child. You don't know what to do with it. You don't know what it means to be a father or a mother. Start where you can start. Right? It's hungry. Make something. And you'll figure it out along the way. And then in her eyes, maybe that teaches the gaze to see a screaming child as an angel without just saying the words, but eventually you see it in such a way that you smile. You love it when that child needs you or something. Now I'm starting to verge on the cliche and the sentimental, which I think means I don't know how to see it. And so I resort to platitudes. In the same way, ideologically possessed resort to platitudes, but believe that those platitudes give them 20/20 vision for their object that no one else can see, if only they could hammer it into them.
Let's take the vision up a step.
Yeah.
In talking about the loving gaze and the seeing, Michael and I have been talking a lot about this lecture that D.C. Schindler did about a thinker by the name of Hans Urs von Balthasar. Have you ever run into him?
No.
He talks a lot about beauty. And this is the way he describes beauty. I mean, this is going to be a very rough paraphrase, but the idea is that some people think that beauty is in the eye of the beholder, you know, and this would be the postmodern view, I guess. Everybody has a different view of beauty, and, you know, it's idiosyncratic, and there's no way of knowing what it, you know, whether anything is beautiful. Peterson would say there is something that is beautiful. And the way you know it's beautiful is when everything lines up. Like when he's talking about how when a piece of music comes together and it all lines up and you get a visceral reaction physically. Well, Hans Urs von Balthasar is talking about how a group of people could go into a museum and all be looking at the same painting. And some of them, while they're standing there, will just all of a sudden just become immobilized in front of the painting. And you can tell that not only are they taking in the beauty of the painting, but something about the beauty has taken them up into it. They become taken up into this higher thing. So you're taking it in, and simultaneously, and this is key to his thinking, it has to be simultaneous. Because if the being taken up into it comes first, then I would have to say the world is completely determinist. I have no control. The rapture overtook me and I had no control over myself. But if at the same time that I'm taking it in, I'm taken up into it, then the choice and the rapture take place at the same time. It's a simultaneous, it's a, you know, it's one of these things that we're always seeing, where there's the two options and then there's this connection. There's something about that's at the structure of the base of the universe. Well, so
that's a lovely depiction. And then just very quickly in Maps of Meaning, Peterson uses the Ouroboros as a snake eating its tail.
yeah.
And I always found that grotesque and sort of fatalistic. But the way in which you describe simultaneity as being caught up into the painting, raptured into it, while simultaneously absorbing it, like letting it come down, that I think is syncopated with the Ouroboros, but it's at a different register. It's so beautiful. Like, it's a meta beauty. It's a beautiful way to conceptualize beauty. And so it seems to be true.
Well, it's been a great picture for me because it helps me understand so many other things that I look at that seem to be the same thing. So I'm going to just do a little bit more from her book and get
Yes, please.
Place. On page 34, she says,
I'm listening. I'm going to turn the light on while you're reading that. I'm listening.
I have classified together as existentialist both philosophers such as Sartre, who claim the title, and philosophers such as Hampshire, Ayer, and who do not claim the title. The characteristic of both is the identification of the true person with the empty choosing will, and the corresponding emphasis upon the idea of movement rather than vision. This goes back to what you were talking about. The emphasis will go with the anti-naturalistic bias of existentialism. There is no point in talking of moral seeing since there is nothing morally to see. Okay, so that's their argument. Now, she says, well, she goes on with this a little bit, and she says, in a simple or easy, unimportant choice, there's no need to regard what goes on as anything beyond the obvious sequence of reason, decision, action, or just even reason, action. And shall I go? Oh, yes, I promised. Or I receive my bill and I pay it. But difficult and painful choices often present this experience of void, of which so much has been made, this sense of not being determined by the reasons. So I started thinking about this idea of difficult and painful choices. Why is it that when you have a painful choice to make, there's a kind of a void, a sense of not being determined by the reasons? Later on the same page on 35, she says, I suggest we can have a more balanced and illuminating account if we simply introduce into the picture the idea of attention or looking, of which I was speaking above. I can only choose within the world I can see, in the moral sense of see, which implies that clear vision is a result of moral imagination and moral effort. So seeing, the choice and the will only come after the seeing. The seeing has to come first. And the reason this is important, and I don't think she talks about this yet anyway, but the reason it's important is that the will is not the rudder, or reason is not the rudder of my will. That which I, in Romans chapter 7, that which I would do, I cannot. I mean, that which I would not do, I cannot stop doing. That which I would do, I cannot do, So something else is driving us, and that something else takes place long before the will gets engaged. And it's the seeing. The seeing is what somehow builds up this universe of values that gets built up around us before the will gets engaged.
Well, I just want to remark really quickly at what I think you did there, which was brilliant. You took the subterranean values that the individuals or groups of individuals might hold that we talked about maybe at the quarter of this conversation, and you spread it out to the universe of values as an extrinsic reaching for, with that parable of looking at the piece of art in the museum and a few being raptured into. That was, I think we've made headway.
Well, when he talks about that, he's saying that rapture is available to everybody who looks at the painting. But not everybody will be taken up into it because of the way that they look at it. So it requires this loving gaze. In the same way that, she tells the story in here of the mother-in-law, or she makes up this picture of a mother-in-law who dislikes her daughter-in-law intensely. And she has judgments about her daughter-in-law. She's coarse, she's unfashionable, she's slovenly. She makes these judgments. So one of the things I notice is that when you make a judgment about another person, it floods you with a certain set of emotions, and you can't manage those emotions because your judgment has your critical spirit has somehow damaged your ability to manage your actions. But she describes this mother-in-law as being so gracious and so perfectly controlled that she's able to, on the surface, appear kind and gracious to this girl in spite of what she thinks of her. But the mother-in-law is wise enough to see inside her own thinking and see, I don't like who I am when I make those judgments. So is there a way I can make this shift, so when I see her, instead of seeing coarse and common, I can see fresh, unique. Instead of seeing her as being unfashionable, I can see her as being idiosyncratic, having her own thoughts about things. So when she can make that shift, she's freed up to love. So when we all have an idea of what beauty is in our heads, but when we determine to see beauty in other people, in the individuals, we have to gaze with a certain gaze. And when we get that loving gaze right, the beauty is there inside every single individual. Because beauty is a thing. Beauty is not just a philosophical idea or a category. There really is such a thing as beauty, just like there really is such thing as reality, just like there really is such thing as truth. These are real, you know?
And I think that's one of the reasons why I love to use the infinite and the finite as my chaos and order.
Oh, and I like what you did there. That's interesting.
So the way I would parse what you said.
Chaos. Infinite would be the chaos and finite
Yes.
would be the order.
Yeah. And so the way I would parse what you said back to myself through that system would be that beauty, we would love to pay the lip service to the beautiful object by calling it infinite. But when we do that, it becomes the vanishing point in the perspective of the painting. Rather, we should acknowledge that when beauty comes, it arrives on time, in a shape, for a duration. The infinite becomes finite, or is finite, and we reverse engineer its infinite quality, we might say. But it's got a quantity right there. I mean, if I walk out with that painting, I will be arrested. I can't say, well, there are an infinite number of these things. There aren't. And I think there's something to the Mosaic law here as a metaphysic litmus test. Do not covet your neighbor's wife. So I read that at this moment as, you know, here's an object of beauty. Here's something people give dowries, give land for, give their hard-earned money, give themselves to. And if beauty was just this all-loving, all-gazing, there's enough for everyone sort of phenomenology, then why would there be such a restriction? Unless God likes to keep the best for himself, then we get the scraps. Well, obviously that's not the case if one believes there's anything to the world other than a deep void of nihilism. There's probably something good in the restriction. So do not covet other particulars. Well, what's the obverse of that? Be chaste with your own. And it works both ways, men and women. Because Christ said, don't cast your pearls before swine. Like there's a sense of particularity in the way in which these mental concepts of truth, justice, and beauty emerge. And then I just want to put the cherry on top of the Bible's full of paradoxes. He says, the meek shall inherit the earth. So here you have a finite contentment, I'm meek. I don't need everything. I don't even need much. I'll do with what I have. It's the epitome of the finite. Apparently, that virtue, that inward struggling to be an outward reality, precipitates everything. Like, that's the thing that gets to have it all. The meek shall inherit. Like, it's waiting. Like, it's not it's not that they are owed everything. It's not that they will earn everything, but the meek shall inherit. It's waiting for them. It's being held for them until, I don't know, meekness is ripe. So it connects with that developmental arc you had outlined earlier.
I really, really like that, because it's the obverse of the thing that we were talking about earlier with beauty, the infinite, sacrificing to become finite so that he can enter into our world. You know, like in is it Philippians chapter 2, where it talks about Christ having everything in glory and the throne, and leaving the throne to make himself of no account, to make himself of no beauty on earth, to make himself of no account. He gives up all that infinity in order to become finite, to enter in. And every time we have that experience of beauty where we're taken up by the rapture of this beautiful thing, that's where we're entering into that experience of being taken up with him. All that we can take in is the finiteness of it. So we are taken up into the infiniteness of it. That saves us from having to see the vanishing perspective in the frame, and still allows us to experience the infinity of the beauty, right?
And I wish it could be expressed, but if it did, it would be lost. So I don't think it can be said any better than how you said it. I would just connect it to something we had established earlier of the Epicurean progressives wanting equality. And so I could imagine an Epicurean progressive overhearing our conversation and saying, yeah, that's fine, so long as I have it too, and everyone has it, even those that don't agree with us, even those that don't want it, because we need to be equal. And only then, only when everyone simultaneously is taken up into the Godhead or the sovereign state or bliss or whatever we choose to call it, can I be on board. I don't think there's anything wrong with that, other than they are paying themselves such a marvelous disservice. Because, and I couldn't find a way, I would not know how to argue this. I think Murdoch is trying, that you can't put in someone's eye what they see. The best you can do is offer some clear eyes to clean out what's blocking. But even then, you can't put in their eyes what you desire for them to desire, because that would be equivalent for you desiring their desire for them. And apparently in the economy of the world, the economy of ontology, we're not in a simulation that allows for me to desire your desire for you, and vice versa. And we certainly try, right? Projection happens all the time, and underhanded tricks and passive aggression and all that. But those are perversions. They're not virtuous. The virtuous thing, apparently.
In a way, utopianism is the same move.
Yes.
Utopianism is the same move because it's an attempt to say everybody in the world should desire this vision that I have. And therefore, this utopian vision that I have is what everybody should be desiring. And therefore, I'm going to use coercion to force everybody to desire that same thing.
Absolutely. It's like you remember the talents? I think the talents parable works here. I was thinking about this the other day when I walked into the bathroom and started washing my hands in the government agency. I thought, because my dear friend, his father passed away earlier this week. He's my best friend since elementary school. And I knew his father. I would deliver papers with his father for my friends sometimes. And he's now not on the earth. Why did I bring up him? My best friend and I were talking, and he was saying something to the effect of, I want to remember the good things and displace the not so good, because that's who he was. That his essence was the good. It wasn't all those other things. And I said to him, this wasn't right of me to say, it's just what came to my mind. Well, today's the first day of the rest of your life with your dad. It's not the end. It's the beginning. And that means you have to have the warts and the eyes. Because that's what apparently we are. We're both. And the talent stack. So Jesus says the king goes to a far off country. I mean, that could mean absolutely anything. It could mean the afterlife. It could mean the other simulation. It could be whatever meme we put in there. Far off country, very precise language. Outer rim stuff, beyond the horizon. 3 people are left with talents. And it's so important that it's a talent, because a talent, some icon, on its own cannot move. It has no agency, but it is full representation. It's a thing that gazes and can be gazed at, but it cannot move. The 3 people left behind, all they are agents. They mean nothing to no one. They don't even know what they are. They're just agents. They just move. So the parable is so precise. The king leaves to a far off country and leaves behind agent and representation. And there are 3 of them, not 2, because if it was just 1, that would be reality and everything would collapse. 2, it would just be the constant good versus evil Star Wars, no moral to the story. But with 3, you get to see something greater than 3 agents. You get to see an arc. Like you said, lifespan development. So you get the 1, he doesn't do anything. He buries the talent. The 2nd, who multiplies it. And the 3rd, who got thrice as much as anyone else, multiplies it by 3, as one would expect for some reason. And when the king comes back, the latter 2 are told, enter into the joy of your master. And it didn't hit me what that could mean until my friend told me when his dad was being wheeled out of the hospital a few days before he passed. He looked up to the sky and said to my best friend, his son, God, I would love to go hunting again. Enter into the joy of your master. So we talk about reciprocal narrowing, talk about addiction and having to get a hit. Well, something a bit wider than that, something that would make someone say, I'm going to iterate these 3 talents into 6. I'm going to do it if it takes me my whole life. There's a vision for that isn't ideologically possessed, and it isn't cranking the arm of a slot machine. And when the king comes back, he says, enter into the joy of your master. Whereas to the first, who buried the talent and sat on it, he isn't told to enter into the joy of your master. He says, leave and somebody dig up that talent and give it to the 3rd man. So he never sought joy, so he's never given joy. And it's like perfect karma. So when you had said about that woman, the stepmother, looking at herself and saying, I don't want to be this way. I don't enjoy myself like this. I think there's a profound lesson and a comparison with the talents and what the God said at the end, enter into the joy of your master. If it's the bottle, you'll get to the very bottom of it. You'll enter into the joy of your master, et cetera, et cetera. It's like a controlling mental concept, not just a funny story in a book.
That's really great. Enter into the joy of your master. This is one of the things that I just absolutely love about the scripture that I've discovered more and more of since I started down this path. And that is that the language of the scripture was perfect for the time in which it was written, and it's perfect for our time. And there's so much truth buried in every word. And I don't mean like Kabbalistic truth or numerology or anything like that. I just mean that every word and every phrase has many, many layers of meaning that are appropriate to whatever the circumstance where God wants to apply that word is appropriate. And here, enter into the joy of your master is this perfect picture of both reciprocal narrowing and reciprocal broadening, because the opposite of the reciprocal narrowing, which happens when the agent and the arena get reciprocally smaller and smaller until the agent and the arena are trapped in this very small hole. The opposite is that when the agent is able to open up their view, their seeing, then they see more options, more opportunities, and then the striving for those more opportunities causes their vision to open more and then more, so the agent and the arena both grow. Well, if your master is infinite, when you enter into the joy of your master, then your joy is going to be infinite. If you enter into the joy of your master and it's the bottle or some other addiction or Chop Hill or whatever it was called in the middle of Seattle, whatever your master is, if your master is your utopian vision that you're trying to cram everybody into, that's all you're going to get. That's all you're going to get. Graffiti strewn streets and in violence and yeah.
But to your point, like there's a mercy in having graffiti on the streets if you're stuck there. And what I mean by there is if you're stuck in that mental space, there's a profound mercy in seeing blazoned before your city all that you have done to it, because at least you're not deceived. Like the worst thing would be to be blind to all that you have, all the chaos. Like to be the Joker in the Dark Knight and to not see the cash that's burning, but just to see the flames. That would be hell itself, because you would never know the depth of your despair in that moment. So you can never, and since you would never know it, you could never get out of it. And that's why it'd be pure hell. But to see it, which is the possibility of reflecting on it, is to be given a way out. And I think that's one of the reasons why Paul said love never fails. Like rock bottom being at the bottom is a profound mercy. Because then someone knows where they are once they've hit it. Like it shouldn't be that way. Like it doesn't have to be that way, that rock bottom is a rock. It could be endless all the way down. Like, there's no reason it isn't, but it isn't. Like that's what I wish I could put in people's eyes, but I'm glad I can't, because I would be a tyrant. Well,
I hope you're writing these things down. Oh
yeah, I meditated on all the time for my book, but that God loves us, like he loves us. Like he gave them something to do when he left. He gave them talents. And those talents are like Bibles, right? They're representations of the one who is gone. He didn't leave them with empty hands. He gave them something to study. And the one who was wrong was the one who buried what he could have studied. And then even he is approached at the end by the king. And he isn't annihilated. He's just sent away. Who knows what will happen if he walks back? It's the one thing that infinity doesn't have to do is surround the finite.
That too is a mercy, right?
I mean, I'm just saying what's on my mind, but it's just like moral philosophy has to argue points, but that simultaneity that I'm riffing off of, that was the beauty of beauty, because it has to come from both directions at the same time. Because the most beautiful moment is not when as we're told in Isaiah, God will run after us with blessings. There's something more beautiful than that. It's the prodigal son, not in his return, because he was full of shame and pity, but the moment when the father and the son's eyes meet, and the father begins running to the son, and the son doesn't run away. If he were to run away, it'd be a half beautiful thing to see. And I think maybe that's one of the reasons why it says that that John would cause the fathers to return to the sons and the sons to the fathers, is you don't get it right the first time at conception. The child doesn't come out saying, yes, rapture me, Father, teach me everything. I want to know thy word. You know, it takes until they're about 45, I don't know, 32, 28 to say, yeah, you might have known something. Right? And then it doesn't matter. It's a finite concession, but it's infinite, because we're drawn into the beauty of the prodigal son not running away for the first time as the father's running to him. You don't even want to see the father catch the son. You just want to see, if you could slow that down forever, people would do it. Thank God we can't. We treat it as cocaine. But it's just that is the infinite coming to the finite. It's beautiful. And it's real. That's the thing that gets me. It's real. It's actually and I think this is what Peterson, why he's famous, is he's able to evoke that in so many people, that it's a real thing and we know it.
And the thing that's so beautiful about that picture that you just developed of the son not turning away, I think that's the key to what Iris Murdoch is talking about when she says she borrows from Simone Weil this image of the loving gaze. It's the same phrase that N.T. Wright uses when he talks about loving to know. That looking with love on whatever it is that captures our attention out in the field, that's an act of courage. The son not turning away, that's the moment at which he becomes the hero, I guess, because he doesn't turn away.
Because put yourself in his mind as an existentialist. Here's your father for whom you've squandered all of your inheritance. You look like you've squandered all the inheritance. He should kill you, and he's running after you. The first thing I would think is, he's going to kill me. Right? You see this beast running after you, and he doesn't turn away. So yes, I think you're onto something with courage. Well,
yes, so I've been thinking about this framework, and I haven't pieced it all together yet, but this is very rough, okay? Gratitude is the baseline, the bottom. So gratitude informs, if you allow, okay, I don't know what the right verb is there, but let's just start with gratitude. If I'm practicing gratitude, that has to teach me something about the structure of the world, because I start behaving with gratitude. Who am I grateful to? They're always telling people to write down in their journal 3 things they're grateful for every day. Okay, well, if you're going to write it down, you somewhere along the line, you're going to start contemplating there must be something greater than me that I'm thankful to. And so that necessarily puts you in a place of humility. So now you've graduated from gratitude to humility. And humility in its beneficence brings me to a place of a willingness to surrender, a willingness to, because I see that I am not adequate for all the things that are necessary, I'm willing to sacrifice something of what I am and have today in order to have a better tomorrow. So that place of sacrifice or surrender, when I'm in that, in some way I am trying to understand the nature of reality or align myself with the truth, which causes me to say, what should I do? It's Jordan Peterson sitting on the edge of his bed saying, you know, here I am. What should I do next? That's the moment where the impulse of what to do and the courage to do it arrive simultaneously. So then you're moving forward with courage into action. So I forget where we started with this, but I thought it fit right where we were, but I can't remember.
No, it did. It was perfectly articulated and arranged. I really, like, the dominoes are hitting for me.
Oh, so we were talking about the prodigal son.
Yes.
So he made a decision that he was willing to surrender his pride. He didn't have anything else to surrender because he'd already, and that's kind of funny, really. He had nothing to bring back. He had nothing to offer. Only thing he had to surrender was his pride. But he came to a place where he was willing to surrender his pride. And so he comes back, but then he still has to face that moment when I'm looking at my father running towards me. Am I looking at him with the eyes of the person who buried their talent, thinking, oh, he's a hard God, right?
Here it comes. Here it comes.
I would turn around and I'd hightail it back to the pigs because he's not only a hard God, he's all powerful. Or am I going to look at him with the eyes of the other ones who said, I believe he's good, and that if I invest and I work and I increase what he gave me, that there's going to be a good end to it. And so it's that moment where that choice is made. How am I going to look at the Father? And it's that choice of a loving gaze that's where I don't know if it's courage or surrender or what that moment comes to, but it makes me think about my daughter when she was about 3 years old. She was really naughty one night. And I wanted her to be able to look me in the eye so that I could give her a loving gaze, not a gaze of disapproval, but a loving gaze. I wanted her to see that in spite of being naughty, she was still loved, right? She didn't want to look me in the eye. Even at the age of 3, we have this feeling of being unwilling to even when love is on offer, we don't want to receive it because there's too much will wrapped up in it, too much, pride, all of that kind of stuff, and a sense of shame and a sense of lack. All of those things get wrapped up in why we don't give eye contact. But I love that picture that you talked about of the son, because that was the moment right there.
We did a marvelous thing together. To Murdoch's point, the father saw the son for the first time in the son's life. He said to the other son, you've been with me all this time. All that I have is yours. But the one who came late, he saw him for the first time in his life. The father had seen him all along, and he had waited for him. He had longed for him. But the son, in all the things you had enumerated, found himself staying. And it was, all right, if he's going to knock me out, I deserve it. Not because I loathe myself, but because I am issued from that man. And he has right over me. And even that acknowledgement of reality kept him there for the blessing. Kept him there like the thief on the cross next to Christ who said, remember me in your kingdom, in your paradise. At least that thief could see the one who had the goods, as all thieves know. where to steal from. He says, remember me in paradise. At least he could see that much. And he was that close to reality. And on that basis, God honored his whole life. This day you will be with me in paradise. You don't have to steal it. You're going to be ushered in. And so too, that son just stayed ready for the walloping. And instead of brass knuckles against the chin, a head on his shoulder and arms on his back. Maybe that's what happens when we die. Like, people talk about the lightness and the gaiety and the music and the loved ones. Like, I don't want to know tomorrow or the next minute, but I'm like, it's probably the thing we talk about when we talk about love and the good and the true and the beautiful. Like, until then, no wonder life is restrictions, because we have to be on guard not to sit when we should stand, and not to stand when we should sit. Like, it's like life now is about restrictions, and someday it won't be. Because I wouldn't want to have too much too soon if it's not the infinite embrace, right? I wouldn't want a surrogate father, if that makes sense, running to me too soon. Meek shall inherit the earth. I feel as if we've taken that code on the locker and we started to move it a little bit at this juncture together. Like, that's just my phenomenology at this moment, my subjectivity. I've been helped by this. Thank you, Karen.
Well, I wonder if I could just clarify one thing that you said. You said the Father saw the Son for the first time. Did you mean to say the Son saw the Father for the first time?
No, I meant to say the Father saw the Son for the first time in his life, in the Son's life. So just as Murdoch talked about the perfectibility of the object, not in and of itself perfecting, but our ability to see it being more clarified. So maybe I just see this little sharp thing, and I hit it, and I see that it's part of this larger structure. And over time, I get to the other end and see this huge nose of the elephant. So this little thing was actually its tail. So it took me time to see the thing as such. I think the Father saw the Son for the first time in the Son's life at that moment. He was waiting for him, and then he finally saw him. And at that moment, he loved him unconditionally. And because the son finally wasn't being someone he wasn't. Like, before, he was, the ungrateful son waiting for his inheritance. That wasn't who he was. He thought that's who he was, but he had to.
I see what you mean. I see what you mean. That the son had, all the layers had peeled away, and the son was really there.
Finally.
Yeah.
And the fact that the Father loved that, because that's one of my own fears in life. If I was stripped of my intellect, if I was stripped of my words, if I was stripped of my mind, would there be anything left to love? Would there be anything worthy? And it's like, I don't want to hear just yeses. I want to know the reality of the yes. And I think we all do behind our camouflage, but we're afraid of it because it would be so intense and we wouldn't know what to do. Just like the son doesn't know what to do, so he stands there. And he starts, jabbering, I'll work for you. Like, I'll be your slave forever. Like, that's what we say. When something good happens to us, okay, how can I deface myself now in front of you? In compensation. It's how we are.
Yeah, and isn't that amazing that there's so much deep understanding of who we are and how we're put together.
Yeah, and he gets better. Like, he's given the robe. He's given everything that the other son has. So these people that are in the reciprocal narrowed lane, like, maybe they're just burning off the stuff that isn't them, and they'll get there. Like, the 12-step program is a beautiful thing. Like, it brings people to the Father. Like, it gets people off bad substrates.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, et cetera, et cetera.
Well, this has been great. We didn't get all the way to We didn't get all the way to 45, so maybe we should pick up where we left off next time.
Yeah.
Left off on page 36, and we could go from 36 to 45 and then maybe move into, if time permits, we could go on a little further into the section on God and good.
Yeah. All right. Thank you, Karen.
You let me know when it would work, and
Will do.
hold on just a second so we can talk for a second offline. I'm going to say goodbye now.